If you hear the fire alarm sound, please treat it as a real emergency. Evacuate the building via the nearest safe escape route. The nearest escape route is via the stairs to your left as you leave the council chamber or public gallery. Exit via the door at the back of the building and walk across the inner car park to the evacuation point, which is the pavement opposite the police station. The lifts can't be used in the event of emergency, and please do not re-enter the building until you're advised it's safe to do so by a member of staff. I think I'm a bit echoey. One of me is enough for anybody, I can assure you. If we can look at the agenda, I have only had a couple of apologies from cabinet members. Councillor PC Wilcox won't be able to hear this evening, and Councillor Julie Jones-Evans. And I said, well, she's been to practically every corporate scrutiny, so I think we could let her off this evening. It's always noted that she does attend whenever that she can. Minutes. Can we go to the minutes, page 5 to 8, please? Any queries? Page 5. Page 6. Page 7. And page 8. I do have a couple of questions arising from the minutes, but they're not queries to the minutes. We ascertained that last time. What's the difference between a query to the minutes? I'm happy to sign them. Thank you. I don't know if anybody else has any queries coming from the minutes. I had one. Which was, and I think it's on the committee's work plan as well. Councillor Blake asked a question seeking an update on the progress with the island speed review. It was advised it's been delayed until January 2025. The committee sought a written update from the leader outlining the progress with this and the cause of the delays. Have we had that written reply? Did we request that from Councillor Jordan? We did. Councillor Jordan.
I wasn't aware there was a delay, Chair, other than the fact that it's now January.
I think most councillors had been advised that it would be by the autumn. I think in anybody's definitions, Councillor Jordan, January is past the autumn. So I would say that that's a delay. So if you could possibly reply to the committee in writing, that would be really appreciated.
Thank you, Chair. I'd need to get, can you explain to me what you mean by delay, though? That's the point.
So every full council, when we've asked when we'd have the outcomes from the speed review and when it would be released to councillors, I think every councillor was under the standing that it would be by the autumn, autumn 2024 as well. We were specific in what year it was going to be. And then when we asked at corporate scrutiny last time when we'd have the results of the review, it was told it had been delayed to January 2025. So there is definitely a delay there from what we have been informed of councillors. So if you could reply to that in writing, that would be brilliant. Thank you.
No problem.
Public question times. Anybody in the hordes in the gallery? No. Point 5, general exceptions, decisions and urgent decisions. That is none. Declarations of interest. And can I just say to everybody, I know in the cabinet papers, we've got the papers on dogs, and I know most of you have got a dog, but let's just accept that you have, and we don't need to declare it. So apart from owning a dog or liking a dog, have we got anything else that needs an exception? No? Are we all okay? Thank you. The only thing that we had on the progress update was the point that I've just raised to the leader, which was about the speed review. So is everyone happy we move on from progress update to the forward plan and committee's work programme. Are you happy with that? Is everybody happy with what they've seen on the forward plan to date? Yes. And most of the stuff now that we review the cabinet agendas, we will be reviewing as well. Just a reminder to everybody that on the forward plan is the timeline of the school place planning process, and we agreed at the last meeting we will have an extra scrutiny to discuss what is on the cabinet agenda and what's on the cabinet agenda only. So that will be the poverty strategy and basically the report that will come out on the place planning. That would be only 2 items on the December agenda, as it's been specially called to do that, to run in line with the cabinet meeting. Committee's work programme. Is everybody happy with what's on the work programme at the moment? I've agreed that the Community Safety Partnership Annual Report will have to be moved to January, because the 10th of December corporate scrutiny has only been called to basically mirror what is on the cabinet agenda. So it wouldn't be right that we've called that meeting to mirror what this cabinet's doing on a Thursday and then to put an extra item on. So if everybody happy, we move that to the January meeting. Okay. Right, we shall move. So, good evening. This is the bit of the evening where we're going to discuss delivery of affordable and social housing for island residents. In the papers, it is the paperwork from 27 to 40. There are some bits as well that can be brought in from the QPR if people have gone through the cabinet agenda and looked at that are relevant to this as well. I'm going to do a bit of a strange one, really. I would like Councillor Brodie to introduce this. It's something that's felt very strongly to him for many years, and to myself as well, but it was Councillor Brodie that wanted it to be put on the agenda, and I think we need to give him the respect to actually, for him to bring in the summary of why we called it, because I know my feelings reflect very much alongside Councillor Brodie's are. And I do feel some of the report that has come to this committee, we will question it, but isn't answering some of the original questions that Councillor Brodie brought. Thank you.
Okay, Chair. Well, that's a bit of a surprise because naturally I've prepared nothing, but then I quite often speak much better when I haven't got a note in front of me. Affordable housing, social housing or whatever is one of the main reasons I stood for election to this council nearly 20 years ago. And frankly, the performance of successive administrations over those 20 years has been very poor, in my view. That's no matter who's running this council, been very poor. And I represent a ward where we delivered probably as much affordable housing as anywhere else in some ways in the Pan Meadows development, where there were 255 affordable units over a period of time. The reason I asked for this to be on the agenda, because I'm also a member of the planning committee, and there's Councillor Drew here is the chair of that, Councillor Critchison alongside me, and Councillor Spink are also members of the planning committee. And we often have quite a lot of discussions about affordable housing on the planning committee and how it's going to be delivered, because the only way this council and previous councils have been delivering affordable housing or social housing, whatever you want to call it, is through the private sector, which has always massively concerned me. We have disagreements. Councillor Spink and I are quite often at loggerheads about delivery of affordable housing. I tend to win the argument, but it's that's through the power of my intellect compared to him, no doubt. But we rub along pretty well, despite our disagreements regarding that. The reason I wanted this on tonight is because, as members of this council will recall, back in February 2022, the Budget Council agreed that we should borrow £40 million towards establishing our own council housing through the housing company that apparently has been set up. Since then, despite repeated inquiries by myself and other members of the council of the responsible cabinet members during the last 3.5 years. We seem to have had nothing but excuses about it. Now, I'm not saying they're political excuses. What I'm saying is that they're excuses emanating from the Section 151 officer, the Director of Finance, who of course is not an employee of this council. He is actually on a contract with us from Portsmouth City Council. That has always been the obstacle that was being presented to us, and Councillor Stevens will know this is something he said to me in the past. We decided to put this on the agenda today because there are a number of questions we want to ask. We've had a report kindly written by Dawn Lang, the strategic manager, on behalf of the Director of Adult Social Services and the Cabinet Member, Councillor Stevens, to give us some background on it. I've got a lot of questions about that report, but I don't want to hog everything today. It's good that we see the three partners in inverted commas, because I think they would query whether they're partners a lot of the time, but we have three partners here from the Isle of Wight. I know David Bull very well from Sovereign Network Group because of the number of tenancies they have within my ward. I've known Martin Pearl for a long time from Vectors Housing Association. He was the chair of Medina Housing Association when I was briefly a director of that. I haven't met Mr. Robertson, is it Richardson? Sorry, Richardson from Southern Housing Group, but I know they, the work that they do as well. It'd be good to hear from them as well. But I'm primarily interested in how we can start to really fund affordable housing, whether it's council housing or social housing, however you want to call it, because there is no doubt, as you will see in the report on page 33, actually the most important driver of all of this is homelessness and housing need. That, I don't know why that's not at the start of the report. I don't know why that's not strategic priority 1, to be frank, because that's what it's all about. It's all about homelessness and housing need. There are serious questions already within those sections that I would like to ask later on. But Chair, I'm not going to say any more there. I don't know how you wish to present this. Yeah, I mean, I think Mr. Ward's online, from Portsmouth. Maybe he can explain to us why we've never been able to do what the council in the majority wanted to do. And we are the people elected democratically by the Isle of Wight. We agreed to borrow £40 million, and that has not happened. Now, as I understand it, that's because of the Section 151 officer. It may not be, it's up to him to explain. It'd also be interesting to see what the housing associations have got planned for the future. I mean, I know what Sovereign have got planned pretty much. I've no idea what Southern have, and I know Vectors. I think when I met with Martin Pearl a few months ago, said that basically the credit card's been maxed out. I don't know if the credit card limit has been increased yet, but perhaps they can also give us a picture of it as well. So I'll leave it there, Chair. I hope that's a reasonably useful introduction off the cuff. Thank you very much. And sorry, Peter, for insulting you.
Not at all. Although I think our views on social housing are fairly similar, in fact.
Thank you. So I am going to bring in, not yet, Councillor Jordan. So thank you for the report. There are questions that come from the report because I think it does miss the point in various parts of it. I think what we need to do is, one, ask the Section 151 officer who's come out of a meeting, hasn't he, to just answer that very specific question. Why have we not yet got a housing company? And we want to hear from him first. Why? We do need to hear from the housing associations. What is your plan? I believe that we've got the other housing association is online as well. And then there are questions. So I think the outside bodies we should bring in first before we have any cabinet members or anybody else answer, because we really respect that it's dark in the evenings and you've come out to attend this meeting, and we appreciate anybody who's online as well attending this. So if we could ask for Chris Ward to answer the question first, where's the 40 million? Why don't we have a housing company? And then to basically ask each of the housing associations, the three of them, what's your plan for the future? What would you like to see happen? Not what's happening now, but what would you like to see happen? And what is causing your roadblocks with this council for that to be achieved? And then I think the really important thing that hasn't been mentioned yet, which we need to go back to, is I've sat through planning meetings before, and they talk about affordable housing. But the point that is completely missed all the way through this report is actually what is affordable to islanders. And what is really interesting is if you go to the quarterly report within the cabinet agenda, there is a great big gap missing when you get to economy and regen, which is the average gross weekly wage for an Isle of Wight resident. So how can we say what's affordable if we can't even put the data in the quarterly report on what the average weekly income is? So, you know, I have sat through planning applications where they're allowing affordable housing in Bembridge, which is going to be sold at the average price will be 400,000. I'm sorry, but that is not affordable to islanders. And as Councillor Brodie said last time, it's not about being able to buy a house. It's how are we making affordable rents? Because we all see what's happening in the rental market at the moment, that the average family can't afford to pay or to meet some of those rents. And some of the rents are obscene. I've made a point of going through Rightmove in the last week and looking at the very few houses that come up to rent and being quite horrified how large they are. You know, some of the rents for a very, I would have said a small end of terrace, some of them are like £1,200 to £1,300 a month. That's a huge amount of somebody's income to try and pay that. So I think that's the bits that we need to get to. So if we can start by bringing in Chris Ward, then the housing associations, and then we'll speak to the cabinet members, and I'm sure everyone's got lots of questions. Chris Ward, are you online? Are you there?
Thank you, Chair. I am here. Okay, so I'll start with the establishment of the housing company. There's a number of considerations before you can legally set up a housing company, and whilst there are a number of things that you would have to go through to consider, one of the primary things, certainly in our context, is that you have to be able to demonstrate through a business case that that company can trade viably. Now, that basically means that the company needs to be able to trade, obviously at worst, break even, but therefore at a surplus. Now, if we then start to think about the extent to which housing development is viable, there probably isn't a organisation in the country where they are providing housing at what we might entirely at local housing rents or even at affordable rents, because in overall terms the viability is really challenged, particularly in the current circumstances where construction costs are relatively high, borrowing costs also relatively high. So in the first instance, in order for a company to start trading, you've got to go through the business case process, and that's a legal requirement for local authorities. So that's always the difficult part. If we then turn to the borrowing aspect, there isn't a model where you can build or acquire housing and do it through borrowing only. There's always got to be some form of cash subsidy. And if I take members back to August 23, I think it was, there was an all-member briefing that took place where we ran through the examples of the extent to which the rent that you can achieve from housing, whether it be at local housing allowance rates or whether it be at affordable rates, the extent to which the rent that is achievable after costs, of course, can support borrowing. And if we look at that today, for example, and let's just use a typical, we'll use a typical unit, say a typical unit, 2-bed. Let's say, for argument's sake, that 2-bed unit costs £200,000. If we were to charge rent at local housing allowance rates, then that would probably support a level of borrowing equivalent to about 40% of the cost. That means that you need to find a further 60% of the cost from an alternative source, i.e. from a cash-backed source that would have to be provided from somewhere. So this goes to the point around why hasn't the council borrowed 40 million to buy houses? Borrowing, regardless of whether the council have provided approval to go ahead and borrow, and when they did provide that approval, of course, it was subject to business case, and that was very clear in the report at that time. We're also regulated by something called the Prudential Code, which means if you borrow, you've got to be able to demonstrate that you can afford the repayments. Well, there's no mechanism to demonstrate that you can afford the repayments on borrowing if the rent that you're receiving only covers effectively 40% of the cost. So you
Sorry,
always
Chris,
need.
Can I just
Sure.
ask you a question before we?
Yeah, of course.
Would.
Of course.
And if anybody wants to jump in, I will allow it, because otherwise it will be, we won't get our questions in. Most developers, so if they owned their own land, when they go to the bank to borrow the money as a developer and they own that land outright, most banks would actually say that's okay, you can borrow against the land that you already own. I know that because I've done it in the past, and I've actually got a piece of land that I'm thinking of building on. So you can, if you own the land completely yourself, then that can be taken into the equation to use that land as a capital to borrow to build. And it also brings your build cost down if you own the land yourself. On page 37 of the report, we've got lots of sites that we actually own completely ourselves. Are they being taken into the equation at all when we're looking at our own housing company?
Every let me use the word acquisition, whether it be a purchase or whether it be a build, but you know, every appraisal has to be looked at on its own merits and under its own circumstances. But when we're talking about borrowing, for example, it's not quite the same as going to the bank and the bank able to recover its money in the event of a default on the loan by taking control of the land and then being able to sell it. We've got to demonstrate that we can afford the borrowing that we actually take out. And for us, that means that we've got to be able to say that the income that we generate will be able to fund the borrowing that we've taken out on that basis. But for our circumstances, if we were to look at an example where we own the land, so that wasn't part of the cost of acquisition, then we would look at that on its merits as well. And that might be a case where the costs are such that they're not as much as we would normally expect if we had to acquire the land, and therefore the viability is different. But even when we've looked at some of those examples on our own land, we've still come to the conclusion that it would still require some form of cash subsidy. And you can't operate a company on that basis, because any company has to be able to trade commercially, and a company is subject to subsidy control as well, which means that it has to basically trade on its own merits, on its own 2 feet, and without public subsidy.
Thank you. I'm just going to bring a couple of questions in. Councillor Lilly, and make sure you make it a question, not a statement, and Councillor Spink. Okay.
Chris, we share you with Portsmouth. Portsmouth seem to build houses all over the place, and they seem to be able to have a covenant to push that through with you. What are we doing wrong because we're getting blocked by you?
Okay, well, thank you for the question. I don't think I'd necessarily agree with the fact that you're being blocked. I think the circumstances are different, and I think the key things. I mean, if I'm making a comparison here, you're comparing one local authority that has a housing revenue account and another local authority that doesn't. And the instances where Portsmouth are acquiring properties in the main from the secondary market, there's not a great deal of new build, but in the main from the secondary market, they also have to put in a cash contribution. It's not a borrowing only model. Now, the cash contribution from Portsmouth in the main is through the sale of council houses. It's a capital receipt through the sale of council houses that is then used as the cash contribution with borrowing to make an acquisition. So I make the same point really, that you will require some form of cash contribution in order to be able to acquire housing and then rent it at affordable or social rents.
Sorry, Chris, can we just come back to that? I've looked into a lot of the stuff about nitrates credits, and there's lots of land on the Isle of Wight that has been purchased by a company quite sensibly, but most of that land, the nitrates credits have been purchased by Portsmouth City Council. So if Portsmouth City Council aren't building, which is what they need the nitrates credits for, they're mostly buying other houses. Why would they want to buy all those nitrates credits? Because we're talking a lot of money and a lot of land that has been bought by Portsmouth City Credit Council just for the relevant nitrates credits. I'm just confused. You know, I'm easily confused.
I don't think that's nothing to do with social housing through the council's house. It's nothing to do with the council's acquisition of housing. I think that's to do with private housing.
But it's Portsmouth City Council that's bought it, the credits.
They have through the Section 106 contributions that have been provided.
Councillor Spink.
Chris, if I may ask you please this. I had understood that a business case had been submitted by Councillors Quirk and Oliver, and that was development on council land using modular housing, which is much cheaper to build. Also taking into account the money saved on paying for temporary accommodation. And my understanding was that although it may be necessary to have a degree of market housing, a small degree of market housing, that would actually work. That's my understanding of the case that they put forward. I don't know if you've seen that case. I hope you have, but it was put forward, and there was some confusion because they were looking at modular housing, which was much cheaper, as I understand it, than, I don't know who, but someone else at the council had put forward. Have you seen that business case?
The only thing that I've seen that sounds akin to that was what was put forward as part of the budget amendment back in February, but that wasn't a fully formed and with a full amount of appropriate due diligence attended to it. So there was a proposition that was put forward in very, very brief outline. That's all. That's the only thing that I've seen.
Just a supplementary, if I may. I think the problem is that it was, as I understand it from those two councillors, it was turned down, and one's not going to go through due diligence, etc., until at least the powers that be, one of whom is you, say that it's possible in principle. And so really relying on due diligence is just a circular argument. We do have to try and solve this housing crisis. And in my view, the real nub of the crisis is social housing for rent. And it doesn't bode well if you can't do it on council-owned land with modular housing, saving all the money on temporary accommodation. I understand when you say if you want to borrow the whole amount that was allocated in the budget, but let's take, for example, one relatively small site, 10 or 20 modular housing. There must be a possibility that that could be progressed, surely, in the way that I'm suggesting.
I'll allow the answer to that, but I don't want this meeting to be taken up with the whole meeting being discussing modular housing. I get the relevance of it, but the point is, part of this question goes back is why we don't have a housing company yet. So we need to keep very much on track, if that's okay. So I'll let Councillor Brodie have his question, or I think it might be a statement. That's fine, that's fine. And then I'll bring back in Chris Ward.
It's a couple of questions, actually, to Chris Ward. Essentially, Chris, you're saying that under the model of the housing company, we'll explore that in a second, we're required to effectively put a deposit down on any loan that we take out. So if we wanted to borrow £40 million, we need to effectively put some equity into what we plan to do. Now, I don't know what percentage would be required for that. You haven't outlined that, but it strikes me that we're not making any efforts to create that treasure pot, for want of a better phrase. For example, land sales. This council over a number of years has sold land off. I've never really known where the receipts from that go. Maybe that's because I haven't paid enough attention in recent years. For example, also in my ward, I'm aware that the Pan Meadows development that this council is almost certainly still owed at least £3 to £4 million by the developers, Barrett David Wilson, because the land that the Pan Meadows development was built on, it was council land. That development was concluded in terms of house building in February, March of this year. That £3 to £4 million would be a good start to that. There's then all the Section 106 affordable housing contributions from small developments, i.e. the ones with less than 10, with less than 10 properties that we see go through repeatedly. But we see no evidence of that going towards affordable housing. Certainly I don't see it, but then I'm just a minor player on this council. So perhaps you could expand on that, because it seems to me that there is, off the top of my head, we could be looking at amassing around about 6, 7, possibly £8 million. Maybe that's a slight overestimate, but towards the sort of 40 million that this council wanted to be borrowing, presumably from the Public Works Loan Board. Secondly, and it's much briefer, we were always talking about this housing company. You provide the rules around the housing company. Is there not another way in which this council can deliver social housing other than a housing company? Would it not be better for us to establish a housing revenue account to start and try and facilitate this? Because I'm increasingly concerned there is no will here, either by councils of successive years or by senior officers, by the corporate management team, to deliver what is quite clearly becoming the highest priority for so many islanders. Thank you, Chair.
Chris.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks, Councillor Brodie. So the first point in terms of having to provide funding for basically equity in the company, you're actually quite right. But as I say, if we're talking about a company, and a company that has to operate viably, it has to operate at arm's length, as I've said, and it has to operate on commercial terms. And part of those commercial terms mean that there can be no public sector subsidy for it in the main, because it's bound by the Subsidy Control Act. That also means that if the council, for example, were to provide equity, i.e. that cash that they could then use as the cash contribution supplemented by borrowing to then acquire housing, the council would also have to demonstrate that, or the company would have to demonstrate that it was going to pay a commercial return on that equity, i.e. through dividends. So it's all, when we talk about housing company, it has to be done on a proper commercial basis. So there'd have to be a demonstration as part of the business case, which would need to be provided, that there were reliable sites and a pipeline of sites. There was building that could take place on those sites, the acquisition and the cost of that, and the repayment of any investment provided by the council would be repaid on commercial terms. So that's all part of the whole business case around the housing company, which is quite difficult to substantiate when we're in this environment where we've got relatively high costs, either construction or debt costs, and in relative terms, relatively low incomes through rents. So that's the first point about, or at least part of the first point about whether the council could get housing off the ground. And yes, if it could get housing off the ground and could it inject capital into a company, yes, it could. But in accordance with the subsidy control rules, we'd still have to be a demonstration that there could be a commercial return on that investment. In terms of Section 106, I am aware that certainly recently, much of the Section 106 contributions has been used or is earmarked for purchases of housing that's going to be provided on an affordable basis. In terms of other options, yes, there is the option to establish a housing revenue account. That would have to go through an obviously quite a extensive exercise to try and demonstrate how that could be done. But in the first instance, the council is able to hold up to 200 properties without establishing a housing revenue account. And that's actually what the council has been doing, certainly over the past 12 to 24 months, in terms of some of the additional affordable housing units that you would have seen in the paper, or ones that are potentially in the pipeline. So I think that in the first instance, yes, max out as much as you can in the general fund before you then get into establishment of a housing revenue account. And you could, of course, at that point, transfer any of those houses from that you've held in the general fund up to your 200 limit into a housing revenue account. But that is obviously a considerable piece of work to establish whether housing revenue account also would be viable. They tend to be established through, I say established or re-established through large scale voluntary transfers, because you've then got the scale upon which to be able to operate and then minimize some of those costs that are currently a drag on some of these financial appraisals around housing acquisition and delivery.
Any other questions at the moment?
Yeah, so just a couple of quick more questions.
Yep.
I mean, I'm aware that Mr. Ward's been on for a while now, and we've got our guests here as well, but just a couple of other questions. Essentially, we've had a change of government in July. The Deputy Prime Minister has, as part of the recent budget, remains committed to the delivery of 300,000 houses a year, I think it is, and there was money in the budget for that. Would it be the case, question one, that if this council gets any money, it won't be able to do anything with it? So we will entirely fail in addressing that government target. Secondly, in terms of accessing money, we don't necessarily have to go down the route of a public works loan board, do we really? This council, it was reported in May of this year, as a pension fund of £750 million, which meets 136% of its liabilities to pensioner members. And I declare an interest, I'm a member of that pensioner scheme. Now, it seems to me, with 750 million, we could almost get the 40 million from that, whilst given a return to the pension fund, and still meeting our liabilities of the best part of 130% of our liabilities. I think I calculated that as around about 35 million if you went down to 130% of liabilities to scheme members. Is there any reason why we can't do that? This is regularly done by local authorities up and down the country. It is supported by housing professionals. You can read numerous articles about it in the Chartered Institute of Housing's internal magazine, Inside Housing, which I read on a regular basis. Once again, I'm just wondering, can we not be can we not be seeking to borrow money from the pension fund, who in return would still get the sort of investment returns from the rents, etc., that they're getting from their investments? Now, I'm no expert on pensions. As I say, I'm a member of the pension scheme, but it seems to me there's an amount of money there that in the past, historically, local authorities used to raid all the time. Now, I know there are strict rules around that now, but you are able to do it. Local authorities up and down the country, particularly in the north, do this. And as I say, housing professionals support it. Thank you, Chair.
Would you like to answer that, Mr. Ward? And then I have a question for you.
Okay, well, those of you that are members of the pension committee or have been members of the pension committee in the past will know that the primary responsibility of the pension committee is to exercise its fiduciary duty, because it's whose money is it, and the money is it's the people that have made the contributions into the pension fund itself. So it's their money, and the pension committee have got to exercise their fiduciary duty to act in their best interest and secure their pensions going forward. These are all questions that are for the pension committee and would all be part of the pension committee's investment strategy. There's lots of movement, if you like, and changes that have happened around pensions recently, particularly in terms of pooling, and the government is encouraging greater pooling, which effectively means pension funds get pooled, but there are also potential provisions for what are called localized investments, but that might actually be done. We've got to stay within the framework that exists, and the framework that exists might be that it's done under a pooled basis if there is that kind of local investment, but it will still have to go through the same type of due diligence, because in terms of being able to give assurance around that fiduciary duty, you've got to know that that return is as secure as it can be, and as secure as any other alternative investment. So any proposition for investment into housing would still have to go through the same type of due diligence that we would have to go through as a council, or a company would have to go through, in order to demonstrate that they could be delivered on a viable basis. So it's possible, but it still has to go through the same due diligence, and the pension fund would have to properly exercise its fiduciary duty in that regard.
And Chair, Mr. Ward probably can't respond, but to my point about the government's housing policy in terms of money that could be coming to this authority, perhaps Councillor Stevens or Councillor Jordan could answer that question for me. Are we going to wash our hands of our housing responsibilities if money's come here from the new government? Thank you.
Thank you. I will bring them in a minute. I know that Chris Ward's got to go back into his meeting, so he's kindly come out. So I think we'll finish the questions for him, and then we'll hand those questions over to Councillor Stevens. I do have a question. I think Councillor Lilly's got one question for you. Then I will let you go, because I think we have given you a little bit of line of questioning, although I do feel that we always seem to repeat this conversation over and over again, and everybody agrees that it's the most important issue, but we don't seem to be coming up with some solutions. I hope out of this meeting this evening, the one thing we do know is that every single elected councillor, this is the top of their priority in all of their wards, is housing. I'll give you a perfect example, and it's when you come down to costings, is in the quarterly review, the number of households with children in bed and breakfast over 6 weeks at the moment are 10. Those growing up in an environment where you have children in a bed and breakfast has very hidden costs to these councils. And those hidden costs will come out as those children get older. You cannot do your homework in a bed and breakfast. You cannot cook your child a proper evening meal or a proper breakfast in bed and breakfast. And we look at the costings of housing, etc., for this council, but what we don't look at is the hidden costs of each. As we know that we have an overspend in children's services, we know what's going on adult social care. A lot of those costs could actually be mitigated by us getting housing right. It is the most important thing that this council needs to do, and I don't think that we put into the equation enough what those costs are. We talk very much about spreadsheets, etc., and all the things that are blocking us, but we don't look at anything that actually can be, let's seize some of these opportunities that we could take and actually progress them further. And I think that's the one thing that I want to come out of this meeting this evening, and that you could take on, Mr. Ward, because Portsmouth does seem to be doing stuff and we seem to be doing very little. I will hand over to Councillor Lilly, and then we'll let you go if that's okay with everybody, and then go on to the housing associations, and then bring in the councillors, the cabinet members at the end of that, because we do thank you for your time here. Councillor Lilly.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Ward, we have been here before over the last few years, and we just go round in circles. I get dizzy actually over it, and we're not solution focused. I worked in mental health for years, and the methodology was talking to people, what is the solution? And we are not getting solution from the officers. I asked the leader of Portsmouth, we have the same, section, 131 officer. Why are you building and we can't? And he said, we just tell him what we want and we get it. Eastleigh district is built. I mean, if you've been to Eastleigh, you can't move for housing being built in Eastleigh. You've got a leader of that council who's actually pushing forward. And I asked him, what is your problem with your section 131? He said, no problem, because we tell him what we want to do.
Councillor Lilly, I think we need to put this to a
question. The question is,
quite personal.
What is the solution, right, to get housing on this island? Because we've been going round to houses for the last 8 years since I've been a councillor, and probably before. We're not getting a solution. Can you work with others to get a solution and help the cabinet to actually get this forward? The housing company, you've just said tonight, is a dead duck. It's absolutely a dead duck, and we need to rethink quickly and get that. And Councillor Brodie's right, because we need an answer for the new government to build houses on this island, rented houses.
Thank you, Councillor Lilly. I don't think you need to respond to that, Mr. Ward. Councillor Drew has a question, and as he hasn't answered one, I'm going to let him be the last question. I always like Councillor Drew's question, so I'm going to have to let him ask one.
I'll keep it very brief. Thank you. So I was just wondering, in terms of the financial situation, it seems like it's based on a comparatively short-termist view. I mean, surely when we're talking of property, we're talking, 20, 30 years in the future, when the inflation rates will have changed, and obviously we don't know whether that's going to go up or down, but it seems to me that the value of property prices is going to go up, particularly with regards to the shortage of land on the island. Is that something we can look at, and what is the status at the moment as to how far we can look into the future? Thank you.
Or at fixed rates.
I'll let Chris Ward answer it, because I do need to let him go back into his meeting. He's kindly come out for us.
Yeah, we take a 50-year view. So we look at the overall acquisition cost. We look at the borrowing costs. So we potentially take out a 50-year loan. So we look at the borrowing costs over 50 years. We look at the rental levels over 50 years. We apply inflation. We look at all of the other costs associated with property over the same period of time. So we're looking at the repairs and maintenance costs, we're looking at the potential voids, we're looking at bad debts, we're looking at the management costs. So we do that over a whole period of 50 years. And then we look to see how the council could potentially afford that over that overall period.
Thank you. I think the one thing, I will let you go, but I think the one thing that has clearly come out from this is we need some answers, because there is no doubt that we will have money coming towards housing. But if we can't actually show how we're going to use that, this may be where we come into the housing associations. They manage to have housing associations. Clearly, you have some way of borrowing the money to do the housing association. So I think it's really good that we bring them in here now to find out what you think the future could look like and how we can not block that. And Mr. Ward, thank you ever so much for your time. We do appreciate it. Appreciate even more if you get some money to build some more houses. Thank you. Who would like to go first from the housing associations? So it's basically, the question is, how much have you done, do you think the picture looks like on the island? We have another housing association online, don't we? And how do you think that we as a council can help the situation? And do you hit any blockers with the council? This is Scrutiny. So we are a critical friend to the cabinet. I will make sure that it's controlled and we're not getting personal about anybody or anything. But we do need to know, are there blockers? How do we actually resolve, which is the biggest issue on the island, which is how do we put affordable rented or shared by houses and sort it out? Martin Pearl first, thank you, from Vectors Housing.
Thank you, Chair. Can I maybe just address a couple of things that have been said so far? So Councillor Brodie said that affordable housing has been provided by the private sector. Clearly that's not the case. I have given a sort of handout round the table for the council members. Vectis has been the main developing association on the island for the last 10 years. And I mean, you ask, can affordable housing be delivered? And the answer is yes, because we've been doing it. So it's, in theory, it's not a problem. To pick up the point of Councillor Spink, actually, I've seen no evidence that modular housing is cheaper. And in fact, it's a bit more expensive. It's just quicker sometimes. But then the problem is, and I think it's been found by the council, the blockage here is getting it onto the island because there's nobody doing it. But that's another issue. I mean, I suppose I've always been a bit bemused by the notion of the housing company in the first place, really. Just that it involves setting up a whole organisation, a whole infrastructure that isn't there. And obviously it is there, but the expertise is with the housing associations. And I can understand the rationale why members might want it, because obviously we've not delivered as a sector in the way that you would have hoped. But then what I'd say is that there's been no discussion about why that's been the case, or what the issues, or any attempt to try and resolve those issues. So, we see ourselves very much as your partners. And I don't think that's always been recognised or always been enabled. What would I like to see? Well, as Councillor Brodie says, we've spent a lot of money over a concerted period of time. We're a small organisation, and as such, unfortunately, when you put your money on your credit card, you have to pay it back. But we are a business, and we model our business over. We do 30-year projections, and all the issues that Mr. Ward mentioned, obviously we do take into account. And I think you just have to be a little bit careful about what you wish for as a housing company, because the sector has found all sorts of issues about repairs, maintenance, costs, the need to upgrade things around energy efficiency and a whole load of other stuff. So there's, and obviously the reason that a lot of councils offloaded their stock in the first place was that it was expensive. So we are the experts, and I would say that the way to get these things moving, because there's no blockages, is to sit down and talk to us and to say, how can we help you to deliver? And, you know, once again, I mean, I've worked closely with the council over a period of time. It's not been great in terms of offloading the sites that it wanted to sell. So in terms of delivery, it's not been tremendous in those things. I've offered some suggestions about how Vectis could help out, and never really got a response to them. So once again, I don't know whether that's
This is a very public meeting, and if you could put in these meetings the offer that you could, that could be clearly noted, and we can make sure that they are looked into.
okay. I mean, they may not be viable, but the fact is that I never got a response to whether they were or not. We are a small association from a Vectis perspective. Although it's maxed out, we will be able to do some development moving forward. But I guess from my perspective, if the council were to get money from the government, funding the housing associations to build will be a much cheaper option for you and a much quicker option. And we've already shown that we can deliver on our promises. We've worked closely with you know, all of the local parish councils. Vectis has delivered housing that people wanted rather than seeing that it's been imposed on them. And once again, you know, I think that's obviously one of the issues on the island is about a reluctance to have affordable housing close to them. I handed out two papers for the committee members. The first, the smaller one, was a presentation I gave to the Chamber of Commerce, actually, and it was back in 2020, but it talked about affordability. And I don't think things have changed significantly, but obviously, as things stand, there are somewhere around 70–80% of the counts of the island's households that can't afford open market prices without subsidy. At the moment, the affordable housing provided by the private rented sector is at probably 80% of market value, because that's their model. 80% is too expensive. So actually what we try and do is to get it to that lower level. And for the majority of households, that's right. What your own comments earlier on, I think, really hit the nail on the head, Chair. I think the problem on the island has been the fact that housing has not been looked at strategically. Not only does it provide the basic foundation for communities on the island, it provides employment, it boosts the economy, it enables health, enables education, it enables so many other things. For me, the biggest problem was when the housing department was split up and housing was sent to the four winds. And as such, it's not been viewed in terms of what the potential costs and benefits are. But without putting words into my colleague's mouth, you know, we are here to deliver on behalf of the council and the island's community, really. And we are experts in doing that.
Before I bring any questions, do you mind if we hear from each of the housing associations? Because what we don't want to do is ask a question, put it all on Martin, it might be relevant. So if we could hear from you guys, and then the gentleman online, if that's okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Councillor Brodie, Matt Richardson from Sovereign Network Group. I think Southern are on the call. No, not at all. I think picking up one of the comments Mr. Pearl made, it's fair to say that Sovereign SNG haven't done what we should have done over the last number of years. Hopefully, the investment in Horsebridge, we are in discussions, in legal discussions on another site on the island. We are talking to officers about one of your existing assets as well. So we are looking to increase the level of affordable housing we bring forward. As an organisation, we are one of Homes England's strategic partners, and we have 84,000 units across our organisational patch from Plymouth to the northern home counties. And there's always significant pressure within the organisation as to where that gets invested. What I can say is the Isle of Wight is one of our five core authorities within the southern patch. And that, I think, picking up a comment that Mr. Ward made and Mr. Pearl made, the housing associations are in a slightly interesting place at the moment. Got a lot of stock, and it's trying to understand if that's the right stock for our residents. Looking at issues around damp, looking at issues around mold, the future of those properties, and there's a huge amount of investment. It goes into the existing properties, and it's trying to understand where the best place to invest to allow us to bring forward not only new properties, but allow us to regenerate existing stock. I think one of the important questions that was raised was our interest in Section 106 opportunities going forward. As an organisation, we are still interested in Section 106 opportunities. However, it needs to be the right Section 106 opportunity. And with regards to that, the organisation is committed to being carbon zero by 2050 and having the right properties going forward with regards to space standards, with regards to solar panels, air source heat pumps, etc., to try and minimise the amount of ongoing maintenance. So we are still very much committed to the island. And as Mr. Pearl said, keen to continue to work with councillors. I mean, I'll throw a slightly controversial comment in there. There's no blockers. One of the interesting things I think Mr. Ward touched on is, and we are finding it across the authorities that we deal in, certain authorities, the build costs have increased significantly over the past few years, disproportionately. And where revenues have not caught up, you are almost reaching a point in certain areas where the cost of building the house is the same as its worth, which causes its own problems, because whilst we are a charitable organisation, we still have to run appraisals, we still have to show how we can make a return on that money to invest back into housing elsewhere. I think the local authority has done an amazing job in allowing a large number of consents to come forward. A lot of those consents, where the affordable housing isn't being picked up, are being stopped. And I do wonder, I think picking up a comment you made, Councillor Brodie, about pot of money that you have for Section 106, if there's an ability, if a developer comes to us and for whatever reason at that particular point there's not an interest, they're able to cascade down the affordable housing to make payments, go to the authority and allow other sites to be unlocked. Because we are, to a large extent, we're fortunate as an organisation because of the size of the organisation, can borrow money on the bond market, pension funds, got our rent roll, etc., etc. We've got Homes England Fund, but we still have resource issues that we need to deal with and maintain.
Thank you, that's appreciated. Could the gentleman online come? You asking gentleman's name? There he is. And you
Hi
are
there.
from Southern Housing. Thank
Yeah.
you.
My name is Rick Barty. I'm from Southern Housing, head of land and partnerships. There's always a difficulty going last because much of the gentlemen have kind of said much of what the problems are with the housing associations at the moment, and I'd echo most of those comments. Southern Housing, we've had a pause in our program for a period whilst we look at our capacity and look at our existing stock. Main fundamentals are with that are our financial model that we assess our sites on doesn't quite match what the requirements and the prices of developers, etc., we can meet. And that pause is primarily around much of the existing stock that we've got and whether we're appropriately matching our current residents' needs. So we don't anticipate the pause to be very long, and when focusing on what the blockers are with the council, well, the blockers are not with yourselves, the blockers are fundamentally with the way that the market is at the moment for us and how we've moved in our strategic priorities. That being said, the island is one of our focus areas. We are regularly talking to Dawn about partnership arrangements, and we're talking about a few sites on the island where you currently own, where we're hoping to kind of bring those forward quite soon. I don't want to kind of talk much of what has already been said, but much of what has been said is where we're having the same issues. What would be good to see in the future for us would be higher grant rates, some the extension of the building safety fund into the rented homes, and just general finance and viability is where we are currently struggling.
Thank you. If you could stay online, that would be really appreciated.
Sure.
Thank you all for your time. We do appreciate it. I'm going to go to the committee now. Who has questions? Councillor Spink. Thank you.
I'd like to ask this question of each of the providers who are here. As a member of planning committee, I know that and I think many on planning committee are tired of being told that we should grant planning consent because it will provide much needed affordable housing. I think if I hear that expression one more time, I'll probably go insane. But the problem is that we grant it, but it's not affordable. And so we're just going round in a massive circle, really. Now, I'm mostly interested in taking people off the housing register. And that means, unless I've misunderstood the situation, that the rents have to be at housing register level. So I think close to the housing benefit. Now, many providers, according to the newspapers, are struggling to do that. So I'd like to ask each of you, please, if there were to be a planning consent and it's 35% so-called affordable with 70%, which is the habit now of the planning committee, to be rented property, will that, if your association takes it, will that result in people coming off our housing register? Will it be therefore affordable by people on the housing register? I think that's what we all want to know, quite frankly.
Could I come in slightly that might help you out before that, if that's okay? And I just need to check if something has changed over the years. So a million years ago, my first job was with the Isle of Wight Council as a housing benefit officer. And in those days, the way that rents were calculated was the start of it for housing benefit, and I believe the same is for universal credits now, is what the rent officer sets as a fair rent. And if that's still the same, if the rent officer is not keeping up with the times and what is a fair rent and what is a market rent, because this is what was happening 30 years ago, was the rent officer was not setting a fair rent and what a level should be for a one person in one flat or a family in 2 beds. Is it still dictated by what the rent officer says is a fair rent before you go? Has that in the last 30 years at least changed?
It has. So we don't have fair rents anymore. Unless it's in a short tenancy, in which case that goes back some way. So a while ago. I mean, the short answer to your question, Councillor Spink, is yes. So we have obviously all the associations have an agreement with the council that 80% of our lettings go to people from the housing register. And obviously, as a housing association that operates solely on the island, all of our accommodation goes to people who are probably on the housing register. Inevitably, what we tend to do, and we've done that with, I think, certainly the last 3 or 4 hour schemes, is have a balance. And I think Matt alluded to that. So you have rented housing, but you probably also offset that slightly for viability purposes with a bit of shared ownership or a bit of, and it's not just for viability, it's also because we know that there's a demand for that. So people who can't get on the property ladder without a bit of assistance. We know that with Branston, we included an extended range of that, and that was extremely popular and extremely helpful for a lot of local residents. But we will aim to get to a social rent level, which is 60%. And bearing in mind now that since, I think the year before last, we got funding on the island, which we didn't have before, from Homes England for grant at social rent level. There's no reason why we can't do that.
Mr. Richardson.
So similar to Mr. Pearl, I mean, ultimately, yes, if we acquire the Section 106, we would then look to bring, and our Sovereign is committed to the delivery of social rented accommodation rather than affordable rented accommodation. That's the corporate commitment that's gone forward, and ultimately where we're on Horsebridge. The difficulty, and apologies taking a couple of steps back, as an organisation, we are still looking at taking Section 106 units across our patch. But there's been a large amount of push because of our Homes England funding to look for us to take alternative routes at delivery of affordable housing. Horsebridge is a case in point, where we've taken the private and turned that into an affordable scheme. And it goes to the heart of the comment I made. I think the local authority needs to look at a different way of treating its affordable housing and how it brings forward development schemes. By all means, you know, first and foremost, as part of the Section 106, there has to be a conversation with ourselves. Are we interested? But it may be, for whatever reason, be it there's not the resources financially, there's not the appetite at the time, you know, picking up Southern's comment, or there's a focus elsewhere for whatever reason, that actually that Section 106 is not going to be picked up by one of us, and therefore that scheme is still being stopped from coming forward. So
Just add something there.
yeah,
Sorry, just to add to that, it depends really on what the planning permission granted is. If it's granted just affordable rent, then the likelihood is that the private developer is going to be looking for 80%, because that's what affordable rent is actually defined as. So there needs to be a stronger push in planning applications for social rents rather than affordable rents.
Thank you. Mr. Batty.
No, I'd echo those points. I think that the blocker is not so much the rents. It's more the viability status that we have even before we get to that stage. We're unable to find the viability on the schemes due to kind of developer aspirations are still quite high.
Thank you. That's appreciated. Councillor Brodie, you had a question.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Firstly, apologies to Mr. Pearl for saying that only the private sector did it. Obviously, I'm aware of what the housing associations do. And sorry, apologies for Mr. Richardson. I couldn't read what it said underneath because the glare or whatever. And I've never met you. I haven't heard your name, but you know, obviously, you know, as a council with 600 of your tenants, you know, to represent, you know, I'm very aware of SNG. My main issue, you know, that with the three of you is primarily most of our affordable housing, and we tend to get it recommended to us as affordable rather than social housing on planning committee. And I think that's probably because of the wording in the current island plan, which, you know, is which this council is attempting to change, though that's been a very long process. That when Section 106, when we agree affordable housing, private developers are finding it very difficult to get housing associations to express any interest. And yet you, Mr. Richardson, just said that the Horsebridge Hill one, Acorn Farm, you know, essentially you're purchasing everything from the private developer. Is that right? You know, but they will tell you, the private developers will tell you that there's a real problem, and you have a situation where some private developers are registering their own provider arms which are a bit more, well, I'm not going to say dodgy, you know, because I'm sure they do with the best of interest, but they're going to charge affordable rents rather than the social rents that you charge. So, you know, is there going to be a change in that? Because one of the things I'm increasingly seeing here is, you know, with Mr. I shouldn't say it, but I can't help Mr. Blocker, you know, over in Portsmouth, and you know, and all the rest of it.
Brody.
Yeah, sorry. But, well, he doesn't work for us, you know, but he's a contractor. Mr. Block, that you are the answer for Mrs. Rayner, you know, in terms of her housing policy for the future, that if money is coming this way, if we can borrow money, you know, that the answer is, and I think you said it, Mark, you know, essentially, give us the money and we will do it. Is that the case? And I mean, I'll leave it open to you.
Give us the money and we'll do it. I mean, at the moment, we have 4 offers in with private developers. The reason they set up their own organisations are that when we make them an offer, we normally do it at 60% of market value, which is what the going rate is, and they feel they can get 80%, so it's easier to do it themselves. Of course, there will always be the odd site, which, because of a particular characteristic of that site, and I'm thinking particularly of the sites in Cowes, Harbourfront, that are just too expensive for us to be able to probably maintain. And we probably will bow out of that. But by and large, Jeff, if they come to us with a sensible proposition, then we will be prepared to work with them.
Sorry, Chair. I'd echo that, Councillor Brodie, the comments you just made. The unique situation with the Horsebridge scheme was that allowed us to leverage in our Homes England grant as one of the strategic partners. And we can only use grant to take housing that would otherwise be private and turn it affordable. And we can't do that on Section 106.
Any other questions for the housing associations? We okay to move on? Thank you. I think that's been really, really good and really useful for us, and hopefully have been really useful for the cabinet members here as well.
Because I mean, the key here is for us getting some money, as far as I'm concerned. Now, personally, I'd rather do it through housing association than some mythical housing company, you know, to be honest, because that's the way I see it, I'm afraid. Nothing's happened, you know, and these guys, you know, and there's women involved as well, you know, so I'm not being sexist, are there. They can deliver it. They have the staff. They probably would need more development staff if Mrs. Rayner has her own way. But, you know, these guys are there. And it's about how we can get the money. And I mean, I still have this view that, you know, and I might propose something later on, that we, as a corporate scrutiny committee, ask the ROI Pension Fund Committee to look at what I was talking about earlier on, because I do think there's a real opportunity there. Thank you.
So I'm going to hand over to ask some questions for the committee, to ask questions of the council leader and the cabinet member. I don't want these questions to go on forever, and I think there are some things that we can accept that have come out of this meeting so far, is that everybody is willing and wants change. Everybody wants change, and we don't want anything to block that. What we want, and the reason for this meeting this evening, was to find solutions how we could actually solve what is the biggest problem on the island, and that's housing. The things that I think have come out of it so far, and we don't need to reiterate it or go over it, is from the housing associations. They are saying that the ideas that we've had for modular housing, we have put money aside for that, but actually it would be better to have property housing. So could we look at moving that part of that budget to support housing associations to do what they do best? So my question would be for Councillor Jordan and Councillor Stevens: do you think so far this meeting has been useful, and glad that it's been called? And how do you think as a cabinet you can work with what has been said this evening to move forward?
I'll come in first, Fiona. Most definitely, it's been very, very helpful. I'd like to thank the committee and and members that have put questions forward and stated their concerns. I'd like to thank the gents from the register providers. First class again. I've been in conversation over the years with SNG and indeed Southern. I've spoken with Martin on a couple of occasions, basically because, as Councillor Brodie pointed out, Vectus had utilised all their finance up at that time. But we were always an open door, always have been an open door, as rental providers understand and know. And it is working in partnership. I think we can work in partnership, as you've said. What I would like to say is over the last 4 years, we've hit our target of 320 affordable homes, which works out at one to two houses per week, I believe it is. Not all
Very
affordable, but I just want to put that forward. And I just wanted to say, we want to work with people.
I am chair.
Yeah, absolutely.
So off, thank you. Part of this meeting has been, and we have continued to say throughout this meeting, that the problem is affordable, as planning permissions are of affordable rent, are not affordable. So to then say to this committee that you've met your targets of affordable rent, what has come out of this meeting quite clearly, led by Councillor Brodie, is affordable rents are not affordable. What we should be looking is social rents. That's come out from the Housing Association. It is screamed loudly this evening. So what we can't then do is listen to the Cabinet summing up a meeting by saying we've met targets, because I think the one important thing that has come out of this meeting this evening is absolutely 100% everybody is agreeing that affordable rents are not affordable. We need to work at social rents, which the housing associations, and has come across strongly, needs to be 60%, not 80%. So we need to be really careful what data we are using in this meeting and agreeing we've met it, because if you go out into your residents and say this is affordable and it's 80%, well, I know families out there who are paying affordable rents, but actually most of their income is going on their rents. They can't afford to put food on their table because they're paying their affordable rent. So please can be really careful replicating data that is coming out from this report that we have quite clearly as a committee realised that actually that's not correct. What we need to know is about social rents. Is that okay? I'd appreciate that. Thank you. So Lily, you have a question?
From the information we had tonight, it seems to me, from first of all, the council can have 200 houses. Shouldn't those houses be targeted to get families out of bed and breakfast within that, perhaps, and the actual house building and development of social rented housing, as stated by Councillor Mosdell, is actually done with the housing associations. And that I'm looking at perhaps, we as a committee put forward a proposal recommendation that there should be a distinction, right? We should use the 200 houses of buying, because I know you're actually buying properties. Those should be to get people out of bed and breakfast. But we need from tonight to start to have a conversation with these guys who are actually saying very, very clearly that they are going to be in a better position to actually start building homes for it. And I think that's why, and we should just put to death this housing company idea once and for all.
Absolutely. Thank you for your comments. I need to remind everybody the remit of this committee. We are corporate scrutiny. We can make recommendations to Cabinet, but it is Cabinet that need to carry out those recommendations, hence why Cabinet is here and listening to that. I will put a little smile on here for Councillor Brodie. Thank goodness we're going into a committee system in May 2025, and then all of you councillors can have an equal say on it. And Councillor Brodie has a question.
Just to clarify that, yes, most of our recommendations should go to the decision-making body, which is the cabinet, but there is one committee of this council that makes decisions entirely separate from that, and that's the Alawite Pension Fund Committee. I think we should be able to make a recommendation to them.
We will. I'll let
Yeah.
Councillor Jordan come back in and Councillor Stevens. So sorry to have cut you off, but it was very important to this committee that we realise the data is skewed when it comes to social and affordable. Thank you, Councillor Jordan. I'm going to
thank you.
turn mine off so you can go on.
Yeah, okay. Thank you, Chair. I'll be very quickly. In answer to Councillor, of course, we already own houses, and I don't have the number exactly, but it's approaching 100 out of 200. So the idea that there's a target of 200 is, of course, not correct. Our target might be near 100. I don't know the exact number, but we have those already. If I just may, of course, and it has been for a number of years in this administration, number one priority, housing. It's our number one priority. It's on the wall upstairs. Chief Exec knows that. We've put into place numbers of measures that demonstrate to everyone that it's our number one priority. Getting the houses built is another challenge, as we're all hearing this evening. Well, this was dealt with. Modular housing isn't cheaper, I'm afraid, than traditional build. But there's a narrative around this. Why don't we build? Why don't we take our land? Well, land's about 20% of your project, so that's the value roughly. What nobody's mentioned tonight, I'm interested to hear about the 106 money, is the infrastructure. Because the infrastructure on a development is probably 20-25% on top of your house build, and sometimes 106 money has to go towards providing that infrastructure. So the idea that you can take all the 106 and use it on housing, we'd have to look at each individual case. But I mean, Chris, our Section 151 officer, did explain some of this 40 and 60%. So now you're talking about 60%, rents at 60%, not the 80%. Well, our island plan, as you know, listed it at 70%. I think we had an aspiration to go to 60. We didn't quite get to 60, but some of that 70%. Some people voted against that. It took forever to get this island plan into place.
Councillor Jordan, we have made sure that this meeting has not been political. So can we make
making a political?
No, but can we make sure we stick? Can we stick to the point and answer the question?
The point is, Chair.
Councillor Jordan, let's just stick to the point of, we've got the housing association here. You don't need to say people didn't vote against staff and things like that. We just want answers to the question and stick to it. Thank you.
Chair, thank you. But the reason that we are still working towards 80% is because we don't have an island plan in place. Because the island plan it lists it at 70%, in some cases 65%. And that island plan could have been placed sooner. So that's a fact. It's not. I'm not making any political points. Numbers of people didn't want the island plan. The housing register was mentioned, and exactly that's what our housing associations want to do. We have an agreement for them to do it. But of course, the housing register is not the same as temporary housing necessarily. And it's the temporary housing that has the costs for this authority, that you can offset some of the unaffordable construction of affordable homes, whatever you want to call affordable. But it was mentioned earlier, roughly, so you can put this in your minds if you wish, roughly, it's £1,500 a square metre to build a house, roughly. So a 3-bed semi, or 3 beds are about 1,650. So roughly for a 3-bed terrace house, it will cost you to build it, modular, £135,000. That's on your land, £135,000. Your infrastructure will be about 20 to 25% of that. So you can add 30,000 to that, 165,000. That's not turnkey. That's so there's a bit more to be added to that. So you'll get about 6 houses per £1 million borrowed. That's roughly what you will get, roughly, on your own land. If you've got to buy the land to build it, it's another 20% on those costs, about another 30,000, right? So six houses per million. Today, if you borrowed £1 million, it will cost this council £78,000 a year in loan costs, something that Chris Ward referred to. 6 houses, £78,000 per year, 12,500 per year per property. That's £1,000 per month per property. That's just your build cost. And I think it was mentioned earlier about how the build costs are now becoming in line with the value, the market value of the house. So there's your problem immediately. Your rents on that, I would guess, should be around £500, £550, and yet your cost to put that property there, to put your £550 a month rent in, is £1,100, twice the cost. And that's the problem this council faces. It's not just our cabinet, it's us as a council. We have to find a way around that. Councillor Brodie's made a suggestion, very, very good suggestion. Whether we can follow that through, I don't know. The 106, I'm not sure that that's going to provide the levels of money. I still think that there's a gap here that this council haven't yet got a solution to. By the way, we're not the only council faced with this problem. And finally, I would add, and Chris, if he's still online, didn't mention that Portsmouth do have a trading company. They also have 17,000 approximately properties, the rent of which they have coming in, but they're owned by the council. Their property trading company lost £500,000 last year. I'll leave it with you, Chair. If I might say, I did say I do need to go to another meeting for 7 o'clock.
Okay, how fast do you drive? Councillor Spink.
Thank you, Chair. I just have a question really for Councillor Jordan. I take on board the comments that you've made as to how much it costs. Have you factored into that, though, the amount of money we would be saving on temporary accommodation? How much per year? Do you know how much per year this council pays on temporary and emergency accommodation?
I do. But of course, what you mentioned, Councillor Spink, was that you're mainly interested in the housing register, which is why I did mention it. Temporary accommodation, roughly £400 a week, roughly £20,000 a year, roughly. It varies, 350 to 450. That's what we pay.
That doesn't sound right. Sorry, Wendy Pereira.
That's a per family cost.
Per what, sorry?
Per family.
Oh, per family. Not total. I was going to say, I thought total 20,000. I thought that's very bargain.
The family, sorry.
20,000 per family.
On average.
That needs to be taken into the equation as well. And the other question, if I may, I have, which might be a question for Councillor Fuller, which I'm not expecting an answer to, but not expecting an answer to now, but perhaps he could ask the planning officers to let me know, because I don't know the answer. And that is this, that Mr. Pearl said that one of the problems is that the planning committee aren't specifying that we want the rented property to be social rents and not affordable rents. Now, we seem to all be being advised by planning officers that we're not able to specify a greater discount than the 20%. So please, can you talk to them and come up with an answer as to can we specify that?
I think now we've submitted the planning strategy, there is more scope to do that. As you'll be aware, as all members will be aware, the planning strategy has policies where we look for deeper discounts. Previously, the deeper discounts that we had were affordable housing figures. That was set by government at 80% of market value. What we have said within our planning strategy is that we know that that is pitch too high for island families, and we have tried our very best to pitch it as low as we possibly can. Now, there is a matrix involved that looks at 1-bedroomed houses, 2-bedroomed houses, 3-bedroomed houses, and there is an assessment on how low we can actually pitch that housing. But again, that has been submitted to the planning inspector, and we are hoping that we will get the thumbs up from that. I think one of the other things that is really important is we are still looking for some direction from government on whether we are going to get the support for the social housing that we desperately need on the island, because at the moment, as we've heard, the viability is not great for developers. And what we have is the island planning strategy, which helps to support the fact that more people can actually hopefully have houses over their head. But I'm quite happy to take that question back to the planning officers in case I've got it all wrong, which wouldn't be the first time. Thank you.
I do. Can I just,
Yeah.
can I just ask? Oh, I thought I had. If the island plan is set at 70%, and if the advice is that we won't be able to go lower than that, if the plan is passed at 70%, if you see what I mean, it seems to be the combined wisdom here that it needs to be at least 60%. And so do we need to represent at the Regulation 19 hearing that our plan should perhaps be a little more flexible and say, for example, between 40% and 60%?
Councillor Fuller, I'm going to let you put that in writing. Reason being is we are 1836 and we need to, we need a really detailed answer. Councillor Blake.
Chairman, I will get that question answered by planning officers.
Thank you. Councillor Blake, I'm going to ask you a question, and then I would like Councillor Brodie to sum this up because he did bring it in the first place, and I did ask him to introduce it. Is everybody happy with that? Okay.
Actually, both my questions are probably going to have to be a written answer because I don't suppose they have information to hand. Just a couple of comments with the questions. I'll just first of all look on the looking forward section on page 38. Obviously, it's outlining that there are currently 1,290 affordable homes in the system, but the delivery on that so far has been 19 plus 38 started. So that represents about a 5% thing. Obviously, that is a market pressures on that, but assuming planning lasts 3 years, are we likely to only obtain 15% of that 1,290 figure over the next 3 years? So that's got a slight comment on that. But the question on that as well is, of those 1,290, do we have a number of what they would actually be this social rather than affordable? And also affordable with in this scenario, should we have a capital A, because it is branding more than it is a descriptive word. So maybe we could differentiate permanently the difference between the two, because it doesn't present clean numbers if we are going to be dealing with two separate affordable rules down the line. The second one goes back to page 34. There's quite a brief table on what is a very complex and difficult issue on point 33, referring to rough sleeping. It simply says a year and a number attached to that. Now, if that is what it seems to present to be, that is saying that there is only 8 people in the last year that are rough sleeping on the island, which I can point out to you 8 within one stretch of Ventnor. So what are the parameters around this table? You know, I say it's a very complex and difficult issue. You can't sort of go around on one day and say, try and count up rough sleepers. I mean, you know, it's can we have a bit more context into what that table is, because it's very simple for what it should be.
Thank you. We will have those in writing because we do need to bring this to a close. Councillor Brodie, could you sum this up? And I believe you have.
Just a couple of comments before I do my best to do that again without notice. Yeah, I mean, I picked up on that what Councillor Blake's just said, because I mean, in the last week, I've found 2 rough sleepers sleeping at the week before last, two rough sleepers at one of the entrances to Barton Primary School in a tent, which you know, I reported online, and I saw two in Newport Town Centre yesterday. You know, so that's four. You know, to say 8 in the last year is a nonsense. And there's a lot of the information in this report that we haven't been able to have time to ask questions on, you know, that I would have liked to have pursued, like such as the number of affordable housing units, you know, developed over the last 5 years, 327. Half of them were the extra homes at Ashy and in Colwell. You know, now whether you define those as affordable homes is debatable in my view. There's a need for extra care homes, but are they necessarily affordable homes? You take that off, you cut the figure in nearly half, which in 5 years makes it, it's already a miserable figure at 327, but it brings it down to about 170. There are many things in there that I mentioned earlier. I mean, I remember when Mr. Pearl was the head of housing for this council. That's how long back I go. I remember when we had a housing department, you know, when I forget his name, Mark, somebody else was your successor. Mark Howell, that's right. You know, it was the head of housing for about 4 years after you left, Martin. You know, but now it's all over the place. Property services, housing, planning, revenues and benefits. How on earth are you ever going to get a strategic view with housing across 4 different silos? It's just a nonsense to me. The way in which we deal with homeless approaches, I mean, the percentage is pitiful. Given that the homeless legislation, I forget which legislation it is now, I go back to the Homeless Persons Act of 1977, I think it was. You know, but 114 acceptances of priority need out of 1,927 last year. I mean, that's absolutely pitiful. But I could go on and on about some of the figures in there, and they're quite clearly, in my view, in housing in general, we're failing. And the housing company, I think that's become evident today, is never going to deliver. Councillor Jones gone because Rides, you know, obviously got a meeting tonight that all the Ride councillors have left for. You know, I felt like running up the white flag because it may all be true, but it's all negativity. And as I asked the question, nobody gave me a response. What happens if we get some money from the Deputy Prime Minister towards housing? Are we just going to run up the white flag on County Hall and take all the other ones down and give up? Because housing is supposedly the priority of this administration. And I don't care what's in that report there, you're not achieving it. And I would have said that to Dave Stewart if he was the leader of the council. I would have said that to David Pugh before that. I would have said that to you, Ian, when you were leader, to Jonathan Baker when he was the leader. And even I'd go back as far as Andy Sutton. You know, I would have said it to all of them. You know, you're failing in housing.
Councillor Brady, I think I have to agree that we had a very positive meeting. I'm very sorry for people that it took on, it's taken
But
so much
it's
time,
the
but it was
fact
so
I can't be positive. It's been a good
But
meeting, Chair.
it did feel then we got a response of,
Yeah.
well, this is why it can't
Yes.
happen.
Yeah.
And that felt quite
Yes.
defeatist.
Can I make a proposal,
yes,
Chair? I mean,
please,
I would
thank
like
you.
to thank the 3 chaps from the Housing Associations here and the chap who was online. You know, I think it's been useful to hear from her, and I do think that's an avenue. I did indicate I might want to propose something tonight as a recommendation. If I could just read that out, and I mean, it's up to you whether you want support, but I think it's worth investigating. Corporate Scrutiny Committee urges the Alawite Pension Fund Committee to consider investing any funds above 130% of current liabilities in social housing. That's all it says. Consider, it's no instruction, it's nothing else. I did point out the scheme has currently got 136% of its liability, 750 million. 6% of that is worth 35 million. Tack on the 4 million we're owed by Barrett's David Wilson, and you're there from practically to the 40 million, aren't you? You could start doing something seriously. We could fund these organisations. Mrs. Rayner might give us another 5 million. We're on the way. We could start doing things.
Councillor Drew, you just put your hand up. Can you just respond? I think it's been a really useful meeting. We've had a proposal that's been seconded. I'm quite happy to vote for it. Could I have a show of hands because it is just a recommendation to consider. It's not to say you need to do this, but actually a recommendation to consider. And at that point, I'm happy to vote for that. Thank you. Wendy's going to say we can't do that now.
No, I was going to add that you actually had some recommendations from Councillor Lilly earlier as well. And I didn't know, and I can't remember what they were, I'm afraid.
Sadly, he has put RIDE before this meeting, so his recommendations can't be taken on board. That's what happens when you're part of a meeting and you priorise somewhere else. If you're not here in person, then your recommendations cannot be taken on board. We are going to move into another bit of a debate, which I'm going to try and close this meeting about 7ish if everybody's happy. It might be a bit of a speed date, might have to go on to 7:30. Can I just thank everybody from the Housing Association for coming this evening? You've been really good and your time has been incredibly useful. Thank you so much. Councillor Stevens.
I think that David would like to put forward some publicity. He's sent out emails to everyone. Councillor Brodie's responded, I know, and so has Councillor Critchison. Would like to just press your button and do.
Thank you. It's just to say we're putting on an event at the Key Arts Centre on 26th of November. Invites gone out to every single Isle of Wight councillor. Hoping a few can make it. We're hoping to get at least half. I know that might be a challenge, but I think we've only got about 8 people so far, so we're a bit disappointed, I guess, really, because we want to talk about all things SNG. We're talking about developments. You can ask loads more questions around everything that we do on the island, including like community fund, housing, a whole shebang, and it's lunch as well. So it's 11 till 1:30 on the 26th of November. So if you've got time to come down, please do. Excuse me.
I have a group meeting this week and I will make sure that my group do respond to your email. Thank you. Thank you for your time. It's really appreciated. Thank you. Does anybody have any questions on page 41 to 50 of budget assumptions? Too long and it's not too much of a statement. Otherwise I'll lean over and turn your microphone off.
If one looks at this report and if one looks at the very helpful page 41, where focus for scrutiny is set out, so were the key budget assumptions in January 24th to the 24-20, what were they? Key budget assumptions, 24 to 25. What has changed with the key budget assumptions and why? And as it goes on. If our purpose of scrutiny is to look at whether these assumptions are reasonable and have taken into account the right information, doesn't corporate scrutiny need to know and to have sight of the documents upon which those forecasts are based? And we don't have that. So how can we say whether those assumptions are reasonable? That's my question. I don't know who would like to answer it.
So Chris Ward is still online, but I do have to say that I can get most of the details that I need from the actual QPR report. I can actually read most of the stuff that I actually need from this report, and it's not because I run my own business and do accounts. I think most of the detail and the explanations are in this report. I will hand over to Chris Ward, but I don't see really why any further information than the information. I was a cabinet member running one of the biggest portfolios, and the information that I used to go on was this report. There wasn't any underlying reports that I saw or anything like that. It was this report that is in the actual quarterly report that would come to cabinet. So I think it sort of answers it, but if Chris wants to give any clarity to that, I'm quite happy. But I, having been a cabinet member, have never used any other information apart from what is in the reports that are presented that is a public document. So that's the part for that. And then I'll hand over to Councillor Brodie. And thank you, Mr. Ward, for staying on.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, the source of the information in the main is summarised in the report. So you'll see references to OBR forecasts. So all of our inflation assumptions going forward are based on OBR forecasts. That's within the body of the report. This is on the spending side. So whether that be retail price index or consumer price index, they come from the OBR. Some of the other spending assumptions associated with what we might anticipate to be growth in social care costs actually largely come from the service themselves and the conversations that we have when we go through the budget setting process. Important to remember that what we're looking at in this report are the assumptions for the next 3 years, not the current year. So this is about are our forecasts robust? Any variations that we're experiencing currently, as you rightly say, Chair, are built into our in-year budget monitoring work, which is reported through QPMR. When it comes to the funding side, because obviously what we're looking at is we're forecasting our spending over the next 3 years and what that looks like, for example, by year 3. We're looking at what our funding looks like over the next 3 years and what it looks like at year 3. We compare our overall spending in the steady state, i.e. to provide the same level of services we are now, with our overall expectations of funding, and therefore is there a gap between the two? That's what gives us our budget gap and our savings requirements. So we've also, on the funding side, council tax, for example, the amounts are in there, but they are also based on what the OBR forecasts for council tax would be over the next 3 years. Business rates, for example, is another funding stream. The uplift in business rates is based on the September CPI. And again, that's based on the OBR forecast for the next 3 years. We've made it clear within the report that we don't anticipate any business rate growth for reasons around uncertainty in the main and around appeals. And government funding, again, we've got no certainty at all about that because it was only a 1-year settlement. But what we have done is used what government have effectively done, which is provide an inflationary uplift. So a real terms steady state position. So I hope that provides some comfort and assurance that the source of the information that we use in the main is from reputable sources. It's the best information available to us at the time.
Thank you. I don't want to dwell on this for too long because I know that everybody's given a lot of time to the housing section. My question would be, when we're looking at spending assumptions and when we're looking at cost of adult social care, we know that we do a review on what we have to pay care providers. Have we taken into account the additional cost to care providers of the increase in the employer's national insurance? Have we had any feedback from that sector that that's causing them worry? Because I know it's causing a lot of worry for small businesses. And then on page 44, we've got some assumptions about business rates. Have we taken into account, and is something that we're going to bring to full council to discuss, is a lot of small businesses are really concerned now about that they're not going to survive. Have we taken into percentage of those, the businesses that are having real issues with the recent budget?
Okay, in terms of, they're good questions actually. In terms of the national insurance uplift, that was never in our forecast. It wasn't known at the time, and it wasn't predicted at the time because obviously when we look back, this was prepared last February. It wasn't predicted that there would be a change in policy associated with change in government around national insurance. So that's not included in our forecast. That will be an added pressure to the council, which will increase the budget gap.
So that would also mean with the social care providers that if this was done pre the budget, you
Yeah.
wouldn't be taking into account the increase in the minimum wage, which will increase across the sector because there has to be a differential between what somebody is working as a general carer to someone who's a senior. So that will come as an additional pressure to adult social care, won't it?
We had assumed an increase in the national living wage, but again, that was buried in the OBR's forecasts at the time. And of course, they were linking it to the work of the Low Pay Commission, which was government policy at the time, where they sought to achieve I think it's from memory, 2/3 of median pay. Now, we'd already got to 2/3 of median pay, and therefore the expectation going forward for the national living wage was that it would then generally rise with general pay levels. But as it turns out, the increase is now 6.7%, and that is some considerable distance above what we had assumed in our forecast, which was only 1.4% for 25-26. So again, you're right, it will be an additional cost pressure to the council if that is passported to social care providers, and only serves to increase the budget gap.
I know I'm being quite dominant here with my questions, but sorry, I had a lot of time to read these papers today with my fluorescent pen. Only one last question for me, and then I'll hand over. Is there on page 44, there is the line that I've highlighted about 3 times that says inflation assumptions are also potentially volatile, and therefore there remains a significant level of uncertainty surrounding the 3 million forecast deficit, and of course including the other stuff that I've said that isn't in here, which could realistically vary between plus or minus. Is that a typo, or could it go up another 5 million up or down?
Yeah, it's not a typo. So the budget report in February said, because of all of these variables, because of all of these assumptions, because of the lack of certainty about what local government funding looks like going forward, the the potential uncertainty around inflation, then the forecast 3 million budget gap could be plus or minus 5 million. So it could get as bad as 8 million, or it could be as good as minus 2 million. So effectively, we were showing what a scenario analysis might look like. So, and apologies, Chair, I didn't answer your question earlier on business rates. But in our forecast going forward, what we've said is no, in aggregate terms across the island, no business rate growth. So you might interpret that to be there may be some new businesses, but there may also be some business failures.
Thank you. Councillor Brodie.
Yes, I'm a little puzzled in some regards, because of course we've got the spending and funding assumptions that we largely knew about at the time of the setting of this year's budget, which was set before the recent general election. And I'm struggling within this paper to, I mean, once again with this council, it's all negativity all the time, isn't it? It's all the bad news about Mrs. Reeves's budget, but there was good news within it as well. And I'm struggling to hear anything. I mean, for instance, social care is going to get increased money from this government. Now, I say this not as a member of that supporting that particular party.
No, I saw your print. It didn't go far enough for you, Councillor Brodie.
Yeah. It's I said that, but there was good news in that budget, and to be honest with you, I didn't read this paper that closely because I thought it's ancient history, a lot of it. I think we probably need something far more up to date if we're going to have any, as Peter Spink points out, we're supposed to be looking at funding and spending assumptions. There's no doubt there's going to be a problem at the end of this year, in terms of an overspend because of historic factors. But, maybe I'm entirely optimistic, but I think perhaps things could be turning a corner in the future. But, I don't know if Mr. Ward would like to comment, but, certainly there's figures like, I mean, I haven't got anything in front of me because I say I didn't spend a lot of time on it. But, there's a significant increase in funding to adult social care across the country. There's a reasonable uplift above inflation for local government in general, and I can't see anything in this report. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. And I'm getting aware that people are getting twitchy and need to go. Could you answer that, Mr. Ward? And then I'm just going to briefly go on to devolution, and then if everyone's happy, we'll call the meeting to a close, if that's all right, unless there's anything pressing. I have been through the cabinet report. I don't think we need to spend all evening talking about where your dog walks, or what's in the tree strategy. So, Mr. Ward, if you could answer that question, and then we'll just briefly go on to devolution, and then I'll call this meeting to a close, if that's okay.
Okay, at the risk of sounding negative, in terms of adults, well, for point number one, the report was prepared prior to the budget, the recent national budget. In terms of adult social care, you know, on a good day, in terms of what has been announced in the budget, that might be an extra £2 million worth of grant for social care. That's social care. That's not adult social care. That's social care, children's and adults. So if we're lucky, we might get something around the 200 million mark. Sorry, the 2 million mark. The pressures this year that are unplanned in social care, adults and children's, 8.4 million. So whilst there's additional funding announced, it's quite some distance from where the amount of additional cost that we're experiencing this year, never mind what the growth next year might be. So from my perspective, that's not sufficient funding to meet the additional demand that this council is experiencing in social care.
Thank you. I think that explains that well. I'm going to move on to the devolution, the last part of the paper that we've had, and because it was written for us on devolution. I have a few questions on it. I'll let everyone else go first and then bring mine in, because I might be duplicating it, and it's for the committee to ask. So Councillor Brake's got a question on devolution. So has Councillor Downer. Has anybody else got a current question, or you're going to come in? And can we all bear with our chief executive, because she looks very poorly and I think she needs a bit of medal for being here. Do you want a strepsil before we bring you in? I have.
Thank you, Chair. I'd let you lead on the where, what's and warehouse of what this report says, but quite key at the point 14 for me, it says that it is suggested that there should be regular meetings of a cross-party group leaders working group with all councillor briefing sessions held wherever a significant milestone is met. Can we strongly recommend that those meetings go ahead with the group leaders to make sure there is constant dialogue, at least with the group leaders, about what's happening, so we're all in the picture?
Thank you. I have made a few notes on this, and I still think that this should have gone to full council to at least. This is one of the things that makes me really pleased that we're moving to a committee system, because this to me is massive. It is really, really massive, and it's only because a certain councillor found out about it that actually it came out in the public as quickly as it did. I think there are lots of questions to ask about devolution, but I think the most important one is, and I don't know if the committee agree with me, that this is such an important decision that it should be made more known to all councillors before we move forward. I know there's a register of interest, but there's things like point 14, there's a general opportunity to work with our local neighbours, but it comes across as if this whole council has had input into this, and they certainly haven't. Have anybody else got any questions on devolution? Councillor Brodie.
Just a point, really. I mean, I would agree with you, and it's every time this arises in recent years, it almost seems to be dealt with on a secret basis. I remember the last independent administration where Jonathan Bacon was the lead council. There was all sorts of discussions behind the scenes at the time, and Councillor Stevens is smiling because he'll remember this as well, behind the scenes, about the possibility of merger almost with the other Solent authorities, which went down like a lead balloon when it eventually got to full council. I have no problem with devolution, but I do have a problem with directly elected mayors, and I always have had. And but a lot of you won't know that back at the election I was first elected to this council, I also organised the No campaign to a directly elected mayor for the Isle of Wight, which won by 60% to 40%. It's one of my greatest election victories on the island, much better than my wins on Pan and Barton or whatever, because the people of the Isle of Wight did not want a directly elected mayor. And I don't think this is of any interest to islanders, to be honest, you know, being entirely parochial about it. Yeah, and I know it's about strategic issues. And I know it's all about, we could have an Andy Burnham. Great if we could have an Andy Burnham, because let's face it, no matter what your party is, he's good. But who knows really who the directly elected mayor of the West Midlands is? Come on, anybody there?
So, Councillor Brady, I completely agree with you,
Yeah.
but I've looked into this, and every devolution deal that has now been put forward that does not have an elected mayor is turned down and sent back. So I do think this is something that has to be discussed in full council, because actually we are all elected by our residents to represent them. And I've spoken to people in the local pub and things like that in my ward and know what they feel about it. So I do think at some point, any further discussions on this needs to come to full council to have those open and honest discussions, because if this deal is presented without an elected mayor as part of it, it will be sent back. Every other one has, and that's my feeling on it. And I think we need to be really honest with the general public that that is what devolution will look like, is to have an elected mayor. We need to be clear and honest. And this smacks of exactly why we should have a committee system. So these types of discussion can be played out where our residents can be involved in them. Now, the days, I do still get that stuff has to be done behind closed doors when it's very confidential information and stuff like that on a big transaction. I get that. But when it's something that will ultimately affect the future of the island, there needs to be open and honest discussions, but also that level of understanding that if we don't have these discussions and we don't get involved, we will be done too, which is another one of my fears. Has anybody else got anything on devolution? Councillor Spink.
Thank you, Chair. I'd just like to take up on Councillor Blake's comment, paragraph 14. Has that working group been set up? And if not, when is it proposed to be set up? A working group of cross-party group leaders with all councillor briefing sessions held whenever a significant milestone is met. So when is that going to be set up if it hasn't been set up already?
I can answer this with a little bit of cynicism, and I'm trying not to because I'm chair. When we put this on the agenda to discuss devolution, there was then a meeting called with group leaders to discuss devolution. So it wasn't, and there has only been one meeting, and it was only after we said that we were going to put devolution on the agenda and into the public domain. There has only been one meeting.
You have a date for the next meeting?
No.
I mean, I would like this committee to recommend in terms of devolution, again, I've got nothing against it, except I'd like to know, you know, it says in the report that this could, local government ensures that decisions are made closer to local people, communities and businesses they affect. Well, that's fine. But a lot of people I've spoken to about it would like to know what degree of say we would have in a devolution deal with, what is it, Portsmouth, Southampton and Hampshire. For example, would our planning committee still make planning decisions? Or would we become an area which is decided and effectively an area where areas on the mainland, which are perhaps don't have much room, will be dumping people on us? I think we really need to know the detail before it's progressed much further.
I agree. Councillor Critchison and then Councillor Downer, and then we'll bring in Chief Executive at the end.
Thank you, Chair. those questions are actually questions we've been asking of our group recently to find out more details, and I've been told that they're having discussions. There isn't that detail yet, because I had exactly those questions. We wanted to know where we were going with this, what with the other authorities, and I think that is a concern for everyone with the cabinet as well, and that until they had those details they couldn't feed them back to us. So I don't think anyone's being kept in the dark, and looking at other Green parties discussing it around the country, everybody's in the same sort of areas with it, that they don't know how this is going to go forward at this stage. So we're all really keen to get these groups together to actually get some answers.
So Christian, I completely agree with that. But if you're running a business and you put a tender in for some work, the main base that you write your tender is against what some of the recommendations are. So there are things that we don't know, lots of things we don't know, but we also know what we do know from the tender documents that have been rejected. So I think some of the stuff is answered already by government by the ones they haven't accepted.
It is, but we're dealing with local government and it's not a business. So that's where the issue always comes back.
Councillor Downer.
Thank you, Chair. Basically, I was going to go along with what Councillor Spink was saying, because I had the same opinion on the last devolution thing that came before us, and that is we will be the poor relation. And I don't agree with it. Why should the other authorities have more say than what we have? We're not going to get proportionate say. So that's what I think. Thank you, Chair.
Councillor Drew.
Thank you. I think I would certainly echo Councillor Brodie's point. I think personally there's something of a democratic deficit in many locally elected mayors, because quite often, as we know, the turnout for local elections is not great. They're then endowed with a huge amount of power that can often be exercised quite partially in relation to where they hail from. That said, I think it's important, if there are governments, as it were, that the simple facts in relation to tendering, if those are the facts, that we do try to push back, because I think, the arbitrariness that we are refused funding purely on whether we have a mayor is absurd. And I think we need to be looking at public law principles potentially and being quite robust. I mean, I appreciate that for a man with a hammer, every problem looks like a nail, and I speak as a lawyer, but I think it is incumbent upon us to push back and to consult as widely as we can.
Thank you. And before I bring the Chief Executive, I have a health warning on this, and probably Laura Gordon's not allowed to nod when I say it. I was in there quite at the very beginning when we became, we've had lots of different things when it came to healthcare. We're all going to work together, and then we were going to become part of the ICB with the JCB, which whatever they're deciding to call it at the moment. And there was all these promises at the very beginning that the Isle of Wight would have an equal seat at the table. And then over the years, the seat gets smaller till you really can't fit your ass on it now. I'm sorry to put it that way, but we do not have a significant seat at the table within the health conversations. It is very led from the mainland. It makes the meetings awkward to get to. And the governance is definitely not as robust as it was meant to be when it was originally set up. I don't want to call you an Laura because you'll get yourself in trouble.
Thank you, Chair. Just picking up on some of the points that have been raised. There is no deal currently on the table. What we have is a conversation between leaders around whether they are prepared to still sit at a table to discuss with government whether devolution is an option for this area or not. Until we get more information from MHCLG as to the likely timescales for progressing a deal, I don't think we're going to be in a position to firm up dates for cross-party meetings. The latest that I've heard is that the Minister is likely to be available for a meeting once the white paper has been produced, which I think is early in 2025. So very little is probably going to move forward in advance of that.
So that means when this comes forward and comes back to be looked at, we will then be running a committee system which will bring everything out into the open, and it will have to be discussed, which greatly pleases me. That's, I want devolution to be discussed. I don't think we should leave the table. but I do think we need to do it in an open and public way. Before you're all allowed to go, I've just been told that we have to just touch on, one sec, just running through the cabinet agenda and just saying that we have no comments, because otherwise we won't be carrying it out properly. Sorry.
Sorry, and then just picking up on the point about, some of the principles of devolution. What we're seeing across the country is that devolution has been about power and joint funding coming down to a combined authority or whatever devolved mechanism exists across an area. It's not about the local area losing power up to the combined authority. And if at any point that suggestion were put on the table, then any authority that is involved in discussions can walk away from the discussions and say, actually, that doesn't reflect where we want to go in terms of devolution. So in that respect, we can be at the table for as long as we want to, and for as long as the conversation reflects where we as an island want to go in terms of devolution.
And that is good. And and as I said, I'm really glad that it's going to play out as a committee system. We have seen in the past when we have done mergers and picked up people's deficits. We don't know how financially sound these councils are. These are all the questions that need to come into the public domain before we move over. Can I just run through the Cabinet's agenda just so if anyone has any comments, because otherwise them services will get really cross with me. Cabinet agenda, are there any comments on the report for housing and finance? I do have some, but I will put them in writing on the QPR report. Is there any that we need pressing this evening? Report for the Cabinet Member for Adult Social Care and Public Health, Isle of Wight partnership arrangements and holiday activity and food. I had one question, which when I can have an answer in writing, is on that holiday activity. Oakfield School gets some of that funding. How will that be taken into account when you're moving forward? If that school is no longer, will that activity be taken into account? We don't need to answer this evening. We can do it in writing. Approval for tree strategy. Anybody want to talk about the tree strategy? This is your day, Claire. No. Reinstatement of public space protection orders. Best laugh I've had in ages. The comments on that are stunning about people being scared of dogs and anti-dogs and things like that. It was just fantastic. Yeah, it's really good. It's really good evening reading. Isle of Wight playing pitch strategy. Anybody has any questions? You could put it in writing.
Just a comment. At the moment, we're trying to deal as a rugby club with getting more use for our football sides. Because it's merger, devolution. We're struggling with Wroxall, for instance, and at the moment there's a huge problem where a lot of these council-owned pitches are only cut about 2 or 3 times per winter, and players are turning up to grass that's about a foot long, and because it's only cut twice a month, it's once every 2 months max. So just I haven't read the report, and I apologise for that, but I just make a comment towards some of the cabinet members who sat in here that it is a huge issue at the moment, trying to get games played on council-owned pitches.
Just for information, I mean, invariably nowadays it's the responsibility of the town, parish, and community councils.
Should we put this in writing?
Can I come in on that?
Yeah.
So they are responsible for paying for it, but the schedule is laid out by the council.
No, it's not in Newport and Carisbrooke. It's not.
In,
we do our
in
own
Wroxall,
contracts. All right.
Wroxall is definitely.
We'll have discussion and put this forward to Cabinet as a question for Thursday. Report, so that's that one. That's it. That is it, isn't it? And any members' questions outside of this committee? No. I am going to let you all go home. Thank you ever so much. I apologise for the meeting being quite long, but it was such an important issue that we really did need to discuss it in full. Thank you.